And I don't believe for a minute that our government, before they appointed her, knew who she was. And even knowing that, she was basically the perfect candidate for the job, you know. Ukrainian descent and a Russophobe, non-stop, every day. Probably wakes up dreaming about bringing Russia down and goes to bed dreaming the same dream. So, we're digressing a bit here. I've gone too far to the future. We was actually at the beginning, weren't we, of the Russophobia kind of, you know, how it all started and what have you. So anyway, after the Second World War, Russia is just rich in resources. It is totally, it doesn't need anything from anyone. If it does need anything from anyone, it's because it's cheaper to buy it abroad than it is to set up the operation at home. But if they have to, they will do, as they've shown over countless years. Even now they're making their own aeroplanes. They're making everything themselves. You know, they've got a little bit of technical help, obviously, but, you know, who doesn't? Most people need help sorting out application forms, so to run a country, I can imagine. So, back to Putin. When the Soviet Union fell, you know, it was like a field day for the Western Allies. It was like the end of the war, you know, they just dived in, feet first, rucksacks available, and they just basically raped and pillaged the country. And it wasn't on their own, there was Russian people who did it, oligarchs I think they called. Don't know where that name comes from or what it means, but to me it just means you're rich and you're rotten. Probably not the case, you know what I mean? You're probably just rich and hated because you're rich, you know, and when you've got money, you've got to be horrible to keep it. You don't have to be horrible to make it, but it does help. Anyway, we spent 40 odd years trying unsuccessfully to bring down the Soviet Union until eventually we just bankrupted them. You know what I mean? If it wouldn't have been for the bankruptcy of them and Gorbachev, because Gorbachev was basically the architect of the demise of the Soviet Union. I'm not saying it was a bad thing, you know, it was a good thing to start with. You know, it was freedom for people, and a lot of people. But this whole idea of, oh, democracy won. No, it didn't. Underhand, shady dealing brought the Soviet Union to its knees, and democracy never played a single part in it. And it doesn't play a single part in it now, because, as I've said, in the death of democracy, it's just a word. It's a word that makes you believe you've got a say in something when you've not. Anyway, so we talk about the French and the German and most other European countries' hatred of Russia. That's because a lot of white Russian nobles during and after the revolution escaped and settled in European capitals, and because of the connection to the Russian nobility, they was able to interact with the country of settling with their nobility, and their hatred got passed on to them, you know. And when children are around hatred, they pick up on it, and if it happens on a daily basis, or if every time you see someone or something and you only hear about hatred around it, you grow up believing the same thing. And, you know, at the end of the Soviet Union, I believe Europe breathed a big sigh of relief. Europe wasn't really involved in the rape of Russia. That was the Americans who basically raped and pillaged and plundered the way through 10 years of so-called Russian democracy, and it's turned round to Western values and the rule-based order and what have you. And all it brought them was a regime, or not a regime, but an ideology that was worse than communism. And I don't say that because I'm a communist. I'm far from a communist, you know what I mean? You know? But I'm saying what America subjected them to was worse than the communist ideology. Anyway, along comes this little scrawny man, quite young really, for a major position in politics. But he gets the top job in Russia. And he loves Russia. And not only does he love Russia, he loves the Russian people, he loves the Russian history, he loves everything about Russia. You know, if you cut him, he would bleed and it would say Russia. That's what I think. And America didn't like this. Oh, didn't like it one little bit. And in the end, they basically started the Cold War again, yeah, because they wanted him out. And they couldn't go in and kill him. They would have loved to, but all that would have done was just turn the Russian people right against the West, because somehow the West believed that the Russian people loved what was going on in Russia before Putin. And that's how thick these people are. You know, they go to universities where they learn about Russia, yeah, but they don't learn the real Russia. They learn about what they believe Russia is, or what they believe Russia should be, you know what I mean? And because of that, they have no understanding whatsoever. So when Putin came in and stopped it all, you know, all the plunder and what have you, for America hated it. But Europe was on board with it, I think. You know, I do believe that if Europe would have played a bigger part at the fall of the Soviet Union, and by with a bigger part, what I mean is if they'd have helped them financially, not for the benefit of Europe, but for the benefit of the Russian people and Russia itself, we wouldn't be where we are today. But because America holds sway over the European countries and its so-called allies, you know what I mean, in NATO, it's able to conjure up this narrative that, this Putin guy is a bad cat, man. We need to keep an eye on him. We need to now start plotting against him, because if he stays in power for any length of time, it'll just be war, you know. And the Russians, it was given promises, and this is when we talk about a promise, you know, if a Prime Minister tells you something to another Prime Minister, or you know, you take it for what it is. It's a promise, and you know, it's the legacy of that presidential person or the Prime Minister. And the next incoming Prime Minister of, they don't destroy the previous leader's legacy. They carry it on. But America doesn't live by normal rules. It makes its own rules up as it goes along. So what happens is Putin knows that it's going to take a lot of time, a lot of hard work to get Russia back to a stability and to increase the quality of life of its citizens and to, you know, to lead a country properly. And that's what Putin has done. He's led Russia properly. And because he was so focused on repairing the damage to Russia from the 10 years the Americans had a grip of it and from the Soviet Union's grip, yeah, he was too busy repairing that damage that when NATO broke its promises about not encroaching 1 inch eastwards and brought the Baltic states into NATO and then Poland and other Eastern Bloc countries. Yeah, Putin was angry, you know, and he constantly reminded them about the promises they made, but they don't care. None of these Western leaders care. You know, they follow the intelligence services predictions and their assessments of, you know, situations. So everyone, and I'm not just talking like 1 or 2 people, I'm talking about entire civil service sectors, you know, the lawmakers, the elites, the former elites, you know, the ex-military, you know, even the present-day military, they all hate Russia because it's pointless having an army if you've got no one to fight. So America employs about 1 million people minimum, even when it's not at war, in its military, you know, format. You know, it has 500,000 soldiers and probably the same amount of backroom staff. So these 1 million people, they begin to hate Russia. And do you wonder why the Europeans have got no armies? Yeah? And they never spent money on NATO. There's no one thought about it, because I thought about it, and the conclusion I've come to is that they didn't need armies and they didn't have to spend money on NATO because they didn't have an enemy anymore. In fact, Russia was a friend. It sold them cheap energy. It allowed them to come into the Russian Federation and conduct business there, earn tens of billions of dollars a year, plus euros, you know, and everyone was happy, so no one needed anything, you know. Why did anyone have to get an army together? If you got an army together, it means you're looking for a fight, you know. It's as simple as that, innit? You know, Russia wants the Ukraine to have an army roughly the size of the European armies now. You know, around about 80, 100,000 men. And why do you need more? Unless you want to fight someone. and the only people you can fight are your neighbours. And it's the reason the EU was set up in the first place. Before the EU, it was the EEC, yeah? And it was set up, and it was partnered countries like Germany, France, not Great Britain, but other European nations, because it stops them from basically rearming in secret and having, you know, invasions of other countries like what Hitler did, you know, in 1939. You know, he secretly built up his army, you know, his air force, his navy. He built everything up, you know, secretly, and then boom, just went absolute crackers on everyone, didn't he? You know what I mean? But a lot of people liked it, and we ended up in countries that the Nazis invaded. You know, they had already Nazi and fascist supporters. Italy was the first fascist country. You know, not many people know that. Many people think Italy was only fascist because of Hitler. Well, it was the other way around. And they even had military battalions and divisions that fought alongside SS divisions on the Eastern Front, where they was just executing tens of thousands of Russians and Yugoslavians and Poles every single day. Every single day they was killing thousands of people. And you know what gets me is, you know, when they had the Nuremberg trials, yeah, they already knew how many people had been killed. They'd already estimated it to be 6 million people, yeah, and most of them they classed as from the Jewish, you know, ethnicity and background. When I think of it, I think, how did they know there was 6 million people killed? You know, and even to this day, it's the same figure, 6 million. You know, there might be little arguments about how many Romanian gypsies and Polish gypsies and Eastern European gypsies were killed, and prisoners of war were worked to death and what have you. But the main figure is 6 million Jews. And if the Western governments knew that, yeah, I find it just criminal. I have no words to express how bad that is. You know what I mean? And it's as if they blame Russia for it. You know what I mean? Not the Jewish people, but the Western civilization, you know, the Greco-Roman civilization. It's like they believe the Russians were responsible when it was the Russians and the Eastern Europeans who suffered it. Maybe that's why they allowed it to happen, because of the hatred for the Russian people and anyone of Russian descent. You know, maybe that's why they did it. Maybe that's why they didn't start the second front in Europe till 1944, when it could have been done in 43. You know, so when you add up all these things, it's just a constant hatred of Russia. And then Russia holds all the resource cards. You know, once the Europeans stop mining coal, you know, once they basically emptied the North Sea of easy gas and oil, we had nothing else to do and give. You know, Germany was our biggest manufacturing base in Europe. You know, building nice cars. They had a great standard of living. You know, and all this was was the responsibility of the Russian people, because they got cheap energy from Russia, and it came through Ukraine, you know, and it came through Turk Stream, and every country in Europe was kept warm and lit through Russian energy. And then the Bidens get involved, and I know it's like you think, oh, big mad conspiracy theorist there, but I'm not. You know, the Ukrainians were stealing Russian oil, and they were selling it. The Bidens were buying it and selling it on. And there's big scandals going on about Hunter Biden and his laptop, but forget all that, yeah? But just remember that his dad, Joe Biden, was vice president at the time, yeah? And he'd been a senator for 40 fucking years, you know what I mean? 40 years. It's insane. You know what I mean? He could actually hold office for that long. And he did. And he was vice president. And, you know, he grew up when it was, you know, Reds under the bed in America. You know, so he surrounded himself with people of the same ilk. You know, and when you've got a superpower like America with an add-on for Russia, they're not getting rid of that add-on till they fucked it. And they started to in the 90s, but they couldn't finish, you know, so they've still got that add-on for it. Biden, you know, he was vice president, like I said, when they had the coup in the Ukraine, when they knew full well what would happen, when they did what they did, but they still went ahead and did it. And then they started, you know, we're gonna, Ukraine can, this is Bush, by the way, now, Ukraine, NATO, and Russia just had enough, you know what I mean? If NATO took Georgia and the Ukraine and brought them into NATO, then that would be it. Russia would just be completely surrounded on all sides by enemies, you know what I mean? It's because of NATO that Russia and China are now friends, you know what I mean? There's no other reason. You know, if it wouldn't have been for NATO, what in Georgia and the Ukraine, we wouldn't have the problems that we have now, you know, and everyone would still be manufacturing everything, sorry, and everyone would have decent and well-paid jobs, even people on benefits, and the social programs in, you know, European countries, they would have a decent standard of living, and people could afford to buy the products that would be continuously made and manufactured using cheap energy from Russia, you know. But it got to the point where after the coup in 2014, it was inevitable that there was going to be war. And that's where we are today, yeah? And for the last 3 or 4 years, we've been sold the lie that, you know, Putin is going to take on Europe. You know, once he's finished with Ukraine, he's coming for Europe. Why would he want to do that? Eh? Even a crank like Donald Trump, he's the only person, and even he wouldn't be that stupid. I mean, he's stupid, but he's not that stupid that he would try and take over an entire half continent with, I don't know, 500 million people, and have to police them and control them and stop them from committing, you know, trouble. As a polite word of saying what they would be doing, you know. So they don't want Europe. What they want is they would want to go back to the way it was. But because Putin knows, and not just Putin, we say Putin like he's the only one who makes a decision in Russia, you know, and he decides what the army does, and he decides what the manufacturing does, and he decides how much the price of gas is and the oil. Can you imagine it? Hey, if you had all that on your plate, hey, you'd be 6 foot under within 6 months because you'd be just having a heart attack. Putin has got more checks and bounds than Donald Trump, yeah? Because all the institutions that control the top brass of Russia, they was already in place. They didn't have to be made or remade. Yeah, they might have been upgraded, but they was already there, and they already functioned quite well. They function well, and you can't fault, well, you can do because you probably hate Russia, you know what I mean, but you couldn't fault what Russia has done in the last 25 years. It's not, I mean, Putin is painted like he's a warmonger. Like I said, first of all, he's painted like he's the only person who makes the decisions in Russia. And second of all, yeah, he's painted as a despot and a tyrant and a dictator who fixes elections and, you know, wants to invade the West. And how anyone can believe that is just beyond me. It is absolutely beyond me. You know, it just doesn't make sense. But like I say, when you're bombarded with it daily, hourly, and you start believing it, once you believe it, it's got you, and you won't want to believe anything else. And that is where all this Russophobia comes from. And then you've got to look at, well, why would Starmer be, and why would Macron be, and why would Merz be, you know, like Russophobes, and the 29 countries in NATO, why would they all be Russophobic? Well, let's just look like, what if they're all corrupt? What if the intelligence services of their own countries, yeah, have got dirt on the people who run the countries? I mean, look at Starmer. 3 Ukrainian models got arrested, setting his car on fire, his former house, and an house from the 1990s that belonged to his best mate, Lord Ali. Yeah? 3 Ukrainians. First of all, what's 3 Ukrainian models doing in England? Why aren't they in Ukraine fighting the Russians? Yeah? That's the first thing I thought, was what they're doing over here. You know, pretending to be actors and students. Eh? Was that to get out of fighting for Ukraine? Or was they allowed out, you know, to sort out elites' desires? And I wonder how many other Ukrainian, and not just young Ukrainian men, what about Ukrainian children that go missing, and the orphans, where You know, you blame Russia for kidnapping them, but I don't think Russia's full of the European disease, which is the PDF and everything else. You know, the predators, and there's the prey. You know, that's how I see it. I see, you know, we can. I look at Starmer, and I don't see a man. I see a weirdo. He doesn't look like. He doesn't look. You know what I'm trying to say. I don't want to come out and say it because I don't fancy getting the door kicked in at about 6 in the morning, you know. But you know what I'm trying to say. He looks like he's got a secret life, you know. And even today, I was watching the telly, and on the news, someone asked, you know, Lindsey Graham, the American, why doesn't he admit to being gay? Yeah, why can't he come out of the closet? And then, you know, when that light bulb goes off in your head, hey, and it made sense now why he's such a proponent of Israel, and why he wants to destroy Iran and Venezuela and anywhere he can have a war. He wants to. He's the loudest voice shouting for war. Hey, and if he is a closet, then I can imagine the intelligence services have got a closet full of blackmail information on him. And if he doesn't do as he's told, his entire life and his legacy is history. Well, it's not history. It is written out of history. And that's what these people fear. So they will do anything to carry on doing what they're doing, because they'll be getting paid. They won't just be allowed to carry on doing what they're doing, you know, when the PDFs are that way inclined or this way inclined, but not, you know, your standard Christian values of marriage and manhood. You know, they'll be getting paid as well, so they're getting money for doing horrible, terrible, disgusting things. You know what I mean? The word just flew right across my head then. Yeah, they are what you call I'll think of the word in a minute, but we'll get back to where I'm at. Is they're getting paid for it, and there's tens of thousands of politicians and ex-politicians and civil servants, the people who actually run the countries that can pick on another country, they're the ones who are allowed to carry on behaving the way they do. You know what I mean? They call deviants. That's the word, isn't it? When you're a deviant, sexual deviant, you know, it's, oh, God. But anyway, so maybe this makes a bit more sense to you now as to why everyone hates Russia and why they want everyone else to hate Russia. Because, you know, they need someone to fight. Donald Trump needs someone to fight, you know. He won't go to war with Iran. Iran will wipe them right out of the Arabian Sea or wherever they're hiding, because they're not off the coast of Iran. You know what I mean? They might be in between the Gulf of the Suez Canal down that stretch and just round the corner, but they're not on the waters of the Gulf states, you know, that surround Iran. Hey, you know, and like I said, you don't build up you don't have that much naval power and not want to use it, because what's the point of having it? It's like buying a new sports car, then you just put it in the garage and never drive it. What's the point? You know what I mean? Yeah, you can do that if you've got 20 other sports cars, you know, but when you've got 20 other sports cars, you'll want to use them all the time. But we're not talking sports cars here. We're talking killing machines, you know, and they want to box in China, box in Iran, box in Venezuela and any other country around there, Cuba, you know, that's what they do. We did it, the British, with our Royal Navy. You know, we policed the seas, and we had the biggest navy in the world. That's why we did it. You know what I mean? And we also had an empire, and that's what America is short of, its empire. You know, it pretends to have one. Excuse me, but it doesn't. Trump wants to make one. That's how he wants to be remembered in history, yeah, as the man who increased the American empire and who brought it off its knees and onto its feet, just like Putin did in Russia. He took the Russian citizen off the floor, dusted them down, and said, listen, no more, we're not subservient to anyone. And that's where America was heading. You know, it's already lost its economic war with China. It's not the biggest producer of anything now, America, except debt. Yeah, maybe the biggest producer of the dollar bill when it's printing, you know, 10 billion, 100 billion every 3 months. You know what I mean? Maybe even $1 trillion a year. I don't know, but their bill keeps going up, doesn't it? That clock they've got, that's supposed to show you the, you know, the debt coming down, doesn't it? Keeps going up. And that brings me back to, you know, we have an atomic clock, don't we? You know, and the other day, the second hand was moved a few more seconds towards midnight. And midnight is like ground zero for nuclear war. Nuclear arm. It's not nuclear war, it's nuclear Armageddon. And when that happens, that's it. No one's going to be around to write anything about anyone and read anything, and it'll just be the blame of a few people. You know, it won't be like we all went crazy, like in the film 28 Days and 28 Days Later. You know what I mean? Nah, none of that. It'll be the responsibility of a few narcissistic, old, and when I say old, I don't mean old-fashioned, I mean old, deviant, degenerate, horrible, and I'm not even going to swear because I'm better than them, you know what I mean? Because I've done whatever. I'm not here to discuss what I've done, you know what I mean? But the fact of the matter is you can see the error of your ways and you change. And when you change, you don't just change for the better, you know. You feel better. Everything about what you've done is better. And with that, I'm going to end this video. And hopefully, you'll find it a bit more watchable than the death of democracy. The death of democracy, I didn't really think about it as much as I have done this one. So, you know, but I again reiterate what I asked for in that video. If anyone would be willing to help me, you know, maybe tell me how I can make these videos visually better, how I can, you know, because I don't know nothing. My digital footprint, it's not a footprint, it's half a fingerprint. You know what I mean? I've probably been on it about 12 months. It took me about 6 weeks to figure out how to upload a video to YouTube. And it's not because I'm stupid, you know what I mean? It's just that I've not got a clue about digital social media. So if anyone would want to get involved in helping me with these videos, believe me, it would be greatly appreciated. And, you know, I would like to hear as well from anyone who watches these videos as to what they think of them and whether they agree, disagree, or whether they agree with this and disagree with that. And I'll ask you to subscribe and like and share, you know, because that's what everyone seems to say. You know, if you like this video, or if you're not already. But anyway, whatever, if you want to, you can do. I don't know what it does. You know, like I said, I'm not after earning any money. I mean, it'd be lovely to earn money, wouldn't it, from just sat talking about stuff you like or stuff you know. Who wouldn't love to do that? But it's not the be-all and end-all of these videos, you know, and ideally I'd like to make them visually better. So if anyone can help, I would greatly appreciate it. So thank you, and goodbye, and I will see you again on my next video. Take care. Bye-bye.